Good afternoon, ELA eighth grade scholars. We're on chapter 2 of A Mighty Long Way, and we're going to go ahead and get started. Chapter 1 was really, really good. We learned a lot about Carlotta's life and her introduction to racism, really, and the role that her family played in helping her to understand the effects of racism as an 8-year-old little girl. We're now moving on to chapter 2, titled The Playing Field. Softball was as much a summertime staple as homemade ice cream around my neighborhood. Practically every evening before sundown, a group of us, my good friends, Herbert Mounts, Peggy Cyrus, Marion Davis, and Reba Davis, and whoever else we could round up throughout the day, gathered for a game. If we ended up with fewer than 10 people, we played in the street. But most days we rallied enough players for a real game, 5 or 6 members per team, and headed across 15th Street to a huge vacant lot. It was shouting distance from my back door, and it became our Ebbets Field in more ways than one. Just a few years after Jackie Robinson broke the color line in Major League Baseball at this historic New York stadium, a group of us school kids crossed that line too on a vacant lot in West Little Rock. Our motives were purely practical. The black kids needed more players to fill our teams. So, as we gathered on the field one day, we just began recruiting the white kids passing on their bikes. Want to join us? One of us called out. Before long, we had a group of regulars: JR, Connie, Billy, Jay, and Pete. The adults stayed out of the way, and there wasn't a moment of trouble or awkwardness. I was keenly aware, though, that what was happening on our field was, to say the least, different. Aside from those 3 months in New York, I had never played with the white kids before. I'd seen my white neighbors in passing, standing in their doorways, sitting on the porches, or riding their bikes along our dusty roads. We usually acknowledged one another with a polite nod or even a hello, but they were lumped together in my mind as simply white people, as nameless and faceless as shadows to me, as I'm sure I was to them. Things were quite different among my black neighbors, which included a mix of professionals: a doctor, lawyer, Philander Smith College professor, a high school teacher, as well as postal, railroad, and construction workers like my dad and Sam Mumford. Mr. Mumford, the one Grandpa Collins claimed was the grandson of former President Zachary Taylor, often worked on construction jobs with my father. He lived about a block away, and every morning about 6 a.m., he would walk to our house to meet Daddy. When I made it to the kitchen, Mr. Mumford would be sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and the newspaper. He always helped with the current events, especially when I got to junior high school. By then, I was taking civics and had to bring in a current news topic for discussion. "So, what's happening in the news today?" I'd ask. Mr. Mumford would look up from the paper and launch a discussion about whatever had caught his attention on the news pages that day. Thanks to him, I left home each morning feeling more prepared for my civics class. The neighborhood was full of people like Mr. Mumford. Even the families that didn't have children my age welcomed us into their homes. The Duncans, an older couple who lived across from us on Valentine Street, had the first television on the block, and I sometimes stopped by to watch my favorite television show, American Bandstand. They had helped to raise their 3 granddaughters, Alexine, Norma, and Billie Jean, all of whom were at least 10 years older than me. The oldest of them, Billie Jean, had babysat me. I especially liked spending time with another neighborhood couple, A.B. and Dow Fox, who were in their 50s and lived across 15th Street next to the field. They were the surrogate grandparents of the neighborhood, the first to stop over with home cooked food if anyone was sick, and the first to offer hugs and help if misfortune struck one of the families. They were the ones who somehow managed to stay connected to everybody's lives. I watched boxing matches with Mr. Fox, an industrial arts teacher and real Renaissance man who also played the cello. Some of our neighbors called him Professor, which he didn't like because he didn't have a doctorate. Though he had graduated from Kansas State Teachers College and pursued postgraduate studies, he still didn't believe he had earned the privilege to be addressed with such esteem. But the title fit him perfectly. Mr. Fox was a smart man and by nature philosophical. He was always teaching, even when he didn't realize in the moment exactly what we were being taught. As I was about to enter junior high school, Mr. Fox warned, always be prepared because you will be tested every day. The thought at first intimidated me because I thought he was talking about written tests. But more conversations with him revealed that he was sharing a deeper lesson about life and making good decisions. His wife, Dow, loved to bake, and she kept homemade goodies around their house. She knew my father had a huge sweet tooth, so she usually sent him home with slices of pound cake or sweet potato pie for him. Her sugar cookies were my favorites, particularly because they were always burnt around the edges. Cookies that looked too neat and fussy never seemed to taste as good. Nobody in the neighborhood could bake like Mrs. Fox. Our neighborhood was full of kids about the same age, and the black parents saw it as their moral duty to keep watch over us all, correct us, and if necessary, report any misbehavior to one another. While parents were generally mild mannered folks who rarely raised their voices, I knew nothing could result in serious trouble at home quicker than embarrassing them or bringing shame to the wall's name by acting up in public. The black kids rode bikes, walked to the corner store, and swam together in the segregated swimming pool at Gilliam Park, a small recreational area operated by the city for Little Rock's black residents. We also knew and respected one another's parents as our own. But when it came to our white playmates, we knew nothing more than their first names. I'm going to stop right here for a moment, class, because I want to take you to chapter 2, structured note questions. So, number 1, what differences did Carlotta notice between her school and Little Rock Central High School? So we haven't even learned anything yet about Dunbar Middle School yet. But once we get there, we're going to want to annotate for details that show the comparison between Dunbar Middle School and Little Rock Central High School. The second question wants you to use evidence from chapter 2 to answer this. Why would the Little Rock School Board create the Blossom Plan in response to the Brown versus Board of Education decision to desegregate school? What effect did the media coverage of the murder of Emmett Till and the Montgomery bus boycott have on Carlotta? How do you know? Use evidence from the text to support your answer. You'll remember last week I gave you some background knowledge about Emmett Till. And at this time, Emmett Till's murder is what sparked MLK and Rosa Parks to do the Montgomery bus boycott. Now, Carlotta is seeing this, Emmett Till and the bus boycott on the news, on TV, hearing it on the radio. How do you think Carlotta felt about Emmett Till in the Montgomery bus boycott? Up here, we know that Governor Faubus of Arkansas is a segregationist. He shut down 3 high schools in an attempt to not segregate schools. So I need you to tell me in this question, what is the Blossom Plan and what did it do? So now you know what you should be annotating for as you are listening to the rest of the reading of the chapter. Carlotta goes on to say, on our playing field, though, everything was level. Our teams were integrated, and every one of us, black and white, played hard. For the most part, we also played fair. We knew one another, hit, caught, and ran. We knew who played dirty and who could steal a base, and none of us above boasting when the game ended in our favor. We'll whip you again tomorrow, I proclaimed many times after victory. I imagined myself Jackie Robinson and always played first or second base. I was somewhat tomboyish and one of the better players. I also was usually among the first ones picked for a team. Occasionally, when we needed an extra player, I called my cousin Robert Henry Harris, who lived with his grandmother on the other side of town during the summer. It would take him about 45 minutes to get to the field on his bike, but we just made small talk to kill the time. Robert Henry, who often saw the Cardinals play when he visited his father in St. Louis, was a pretty good center fielder. But when his team began winning too often, the losers started complaining and demanded a new rule. No one from outside the neighborhood was allowed to play in our games. In those moments on that field, there was no black or white, just winners and losers and kids being kids. The only outsider was a too good center fielder who had seen too many professional baseball games up in St. Louis. Away from the field, though, the boundaries were clear and unspoken. When it was time for a game, a few of us black kids might walk over to a white neighbor's yard and just stand there close to the road until a parent spotted us. We knew better to even knock on the door. There's a colored kid in the yard, we hear one of the white parents yell. Soon, our white playmate would come running out ready to play. There were times, too, when a white neighborhood kid walked over to my yard and just waited. Some white kid is outside, Mother called out to me. I grabbed my mitt and dashed outside. Most days we played so hard under the blazing Arkansas sun that we had to stop for water breaks. The black kids would all run over to one of our yards and turn on an outdoor water faucet, usually connected to a long green hose. We take turns sipping from the cool stream pouring from that pipe. I suppose the white kids ran to their yards or homes too, because they seemed to disappear like ghosts. Then we'd all meet back on the field and play until hunger got the best of us, or the grown ups called us home, except for the white kids on our teams. The rest of us had known one another practically all our lives. Most of us were students at Stevens Elementary. It was the neighborhood elementary school, and it was named in honor of Charlotte Stevens, the first black teacher in Little Rock. She had taught English and Latin for 60 years, more than any other teacher in the school district's history, mostly at Dunbar, where she also served some of the time as a librarian. Stevens Elementary was the physical and cultural center of the neighborhood, a place that drew practically everyone together for holidays and special occasions. In my early days there, the school was an old multi-story building that sat atop the hill on West 18th Street. Big wood burning stoves in each room provided heat in the winter, and we relied on Mother Nature and the help of big fans to keep the rooms comfortable in early summer. None of the schools and only the one or two homes I'd visited were air conditioned back then. The school's wooden floors were cleaned religiously with linseed oil, which left a thin shine and light oily scent. But the old building was replaced a couple years after I arrived by a one-story California style model, similar to the building that sits in the same spot today. From as early as I can remember, I walked up that hill every day alone or with other schoolmates to class. Parents felt safe enough to let us go, and I certainly didn't feel a need to have mother or daddy tag along. I was a sixth grader at Stevens in May 1954 when news about the historic Brown versus Board of Education broke. I read about it in the Weekly Reader, a popular children's newspaper. My teacher, Mrs. King, explained that the highest court in the land had decided it was unfair and against the law for black and white children to attend separate schools. Black children would finally have access to the same opportunities the white students had, she told us. Being a kid, I thought she meant we'd see some changes, new books, at least right away. I was disappointed when, as far as I could tell, nothing changed that year. The next year, I moved to the all black Paul Laurence Dunbar Junior and Senior High School, which had been named for the internationally renowned black poet. Some days I caught a ride with a family member or rode the city bus to school to Dunbar, but most of the time I walked the 2+ miles. I'd pass Roseland Cemetery and cross the bridge over the Union Pacific Railroad track. Then there it was to my left, just 1 mile from my house, the all white Little Rock Central High School. From that angle, I could see only the huge football field and stadium. That grand school building with a campus that spread across 4 square blocks loomed just beyond. the distance. The stadium was so close that on Friday and Saturday evenings during football season, I could see the bright light shining from Central's football field in the neighborhood. That stadium and field house were the envy of schools everywhere. Class, I want to stop right here because on page 32 is a lot of descriptions or imagery of how Dunbar School looks in comparison to Little Rock Central High School. I want you to highlight as you're reading, pay attention. But the school's reputation extended far beyond its championship football teams and sports facilities. Mr. Fox had taken classes at the University of Kansas with Jess Matthews, Central's principal. So when I visited the Foxes, I always got an earful about the school's academic success and first rate programs. The school had a stellar reputation for sending its graduates to the top rated colleges in the country, often on scholarships, Mr. Fox told me. It also had a huge 2,000 seat auditorium, professional stage, and state of the art lighting for students interested in theater. Students interested in biology and science had access to a fully equipped greenhouse. Sometimes, as I pass Central, I wonder what it would be like to be a student there and have access to all of that and more. I was serious I was a serious student who made A's and B's and spent a good bit of time thinking about my future. I had recently begun dreaming of becoming a doctor after reading about Madame Curie, the first woman in France to receive a doctorate and the only woman to receive the Nobel Prize twice. She wasn't a medical doctor, but she was a brilliant scientist whose discoveries in the field of radiation changed the world. I like that her discoveries helped prove to the world the scientific capabilities of women. I heard one of my uncles say that he once wanted to become a doctor, so I figured that would be a good field for me. I didn't know of any women doctors and certainly not any black ones, but Madame Curie had inspired me to take a chance. I loved science and I liked the idea of helping people, of changing the world. I was sure that Central would have everything I needed to reach those goals someday. Maybe there, I thought, I could even get a new biology or chemistry book, one that I could write my name in. At Dunbar, all of my books were hand me downs from the white schools. By the time I got them, a white kid's name usually was already scrawled across the front cover. Some of the books were so shabby and worn that they were missing pages. Guys, pay attention to these descriptions of the books at Dunbar. Carlotta continues that my ears would always perk up when I heard the white kids on our neighborhood softball teams talking to one another about new lab equipment coming to their school or a new book a teacher had promised. New books and resources for the white kids usually meant newer hand me downs for the black kids, always far better than anything we had. I frequently heard complaints about the outdated books, limited supplies, and inferior equipment at the black schools from the relatives and family friends who worked there. Practically everywhere I turned at Dunbar, I was under the watchful eye of an aunt, uncle, or family friend who was on staff. Among them were my Aunt Eva, the librarian, Uncle Silas, who taught about mechanics, and Mr. Fox. My seventh grade gym teacher also became my aunt Walitha when she married my mother's brother, Mad Jr., the summer after I took her class. I'd hear the adults talking among themselves about the injustice of it all, with white schools always getting the best of everything. The disparities between Dunbar and Central can be traced to their beginnings. I'm going to highlight that, class. It can be traced to their beginnings. You should be annotating the text too as I read. Very important. In 1927, the Little Rock School District spent 1.5 million to build Little Rock High School, which was renamed Little Rock Central High in 1953. News reports called the school the most elaborate and expensive high school in the nation. School officials had poured so much of the system's resources into the construction that little was left to build a school for Black children. But private financing came forth from philanthropists John D. Rockefeller and Julius Rosenwald for the construction 2 years later of Dunbar, then called the N-Word School of Industrial Arts. Rosenwald, part owner of Sears, Roebuck and Company, worked with Booker T. Washington from 1912 to 1932 to build almost 5,000 schools for Black children throughout the South. Dunbar, which cost 400,000 to build, still sits in the same spot. It is one of a few Rosenwald schools that are still operational. The architects of Dunbar had contributed to the design of Central, so the schools look quite similar. Both are regal looking old buildings with columns and concrete steps that lead to a grand entrance. Their brick and stone facades reflect the Art Deco style popular in the early 20th century, but the schools have always been far from equal. Central, with 100 classrooms spread across 600,000 square feet, served as a senior high school and junior college. Meanwhile, Dunbar, with 34 classrooms spread over 200,000 square feet, operated as a junior high, senior high, and junior college. While Central's first library was stocked with 11,000 library books, Dunbar's first library had only 5,000 books. Central had both a gymnasium and a stadium, but Dunbar had neither until 1950 when a gym was added. Guys, this entire section here is so has so much information. I mean, she goes on to start off here talking about Central. Okay, and then she says, meanwhile, Dunbar. There are a bunch of comparisons between Dunbar and Central. Make sure your answer is you have an effective, clear, and concise response to your homework question. A lot of information here. The boys and girls basketball teams practice and played at large halls or centers located in the Black community, including the Masonic Temple, YMCA, and Arkansas Baptist College. At reunions over the years, I've heard athletes talk about having to walk as far as 16 blocks for football practice. I've also seen documents showing that Central's first principal in 1927 made a salary of $500 per month, compared with the $344 per month paid to Dunbar's principal. By 1954, the school district was spending $102.25 per child on white students, but only $67.75 per child on Black students. Despite the discrepancies, though, Dunbar was far more modern than the one room shacks where Black children were educated throughout much of the South. Its all Black staff was highly educated and helped to create an academically rigorous curriculum that in 1931 resulted in accreditation from the North Central Association of Colleges and Schools. Most white schools in Little Rock, with all of their resources, had not achieved such status. Many of Dunbar's teachers had advanced degrees and often spent their summers taking classes at northern universities. What they lacked in resources, they made up in creativity and dedication. Educating Black children was more than a job back then, it was a mission. One that, for most of the teacher, was rooted in the teachings of historically Black colleges and universities created in the wake of the Civil War to educate freed slaves. They were schools like Philander Smith College, which had many alumni along Dunbar staff. The 24-acre campus of Philander Smith sat right in the heart of the Black Little Rock. Before the construction of Interstate 630 in the late 1970s, the school was walking distance from the Black Business District on West 9th Street. Students and staff from the campus could walk a short distance and patronize the array of Black owned and operated businesses, which included barber and beauty shops, restaurants and cafes, doctors and lawyers' offices, taverns, a cab stand, a liquor store, an insurance company, and more. Then the interstate sliced the path right down the middle, leaving the university and businesses on opposite sides of a busy federal highway. But Philander Smith was a vibrant part of the Black community. It instilled in its students an obligation to give back to the community. In that spirit, the Dunbar staff pushed us to excel, expected it, and drilled in us that when we stepped outside the schoolhouse doors, we not only represented our families and our school, but we also represented the race. My biology teacher, Edna Douglas, was one of my favorites. She had taught mother, and she was a worldly woman who traveled extensively out of the country during the summer. She wove stories of her travels into her lectures and left us captivated with her descriptions of the people and places she had seen. Mrs. Douglas did more than teach science. She took us to those faraway places and made them more than just dots on a map. She engaged me in the world beyond Little Rock and made me want to see more of it. A good education was the door to the broader world, she told her students. And when we stepped into that broader world, she said, we represented the best of Dunbar and of colored people. Dunbar's reputation as a top notch school attracted Black students from all over Arkansas who stayed with relatives to attend. Some were from well to do families who wanted their children to have access to the best possible education. Others were from rural areas that had no schools for Black children. Not only did my parents graduate from Dunbar's high school, but mother also graduated from the junior college. After World War II, Daddy spent a year at junior college on the GI Bill, too. They never lost their tremendous affection for their alma mater. To this day, I usually accompany Mother to the school's biggest biennial reunions, which draw hundreds of proud and accomplished former students and staff to rotating venues throughout the country. I too have fond memories of Dunbar. I was an honor student and active in a number of extracurricular activities. I was captain of the girls basketball team, a class representative on the student council, a member of the Junior National Honor Society, captain of the cheerleading squad, and a member of the choir. I also served as vice president of the student council 2 years in a row. In my day, women were never selected to be president of the council. I was in the seventh grade at Dunbar when the school district announced plans to build two new high schools, Horace Mann for Black students and Hall High for whites. Dunbar was to convert exclusively to a junior high school when the new high schools opened in fall 1956. Word of the new black high school circulated quickly among my junior high school peers, and we were excited about it. I didn't realize then that the new school was part of an overall plan that had been unanimously approved by the school board in May 1955 to respond to the Supreme Court decision that I had read about the previous year in the Weekly Reader. The school systems plan called for a deliberately slow process of desegregation that would be phased in over 6 years. Guys, here's a vocabulary word: desegregation. Go ahead and circle that word. It would start with a small number of Black students entering Central High School in the fall of 1957. Selected Black students in the following years then would enter previously all white junior high and elementary school in phases 2 and 3, which would be implemented through 1963. The proposal would come to be known as the Blossom Plan, named for Virgil T. Blossom, superintendent of Little Rock Public Schools. Guys, we're going to go ahead and circle this because, or annotate it. You can come back to it, but I'm just going to put like a bracket here and then a bracket here. If I went back to my homework question, number 2 asks you about the Blossom Plan. What is it? What did the Blossom Plan attempt to do for the integration of schools? Then it goes on to say more information here. Under Blossom Plan, desegregation of the schools would follow the city's residential patterns. As one school board member suggested, the plan would provide as little integration as possible for as long as legally possible. That's real tricky. Slow integration process. We're going to let a few Black kids in this year, and then we're going to add 10 more kids next year, whatever the plan suggested for that particular city and school. Man will be built on the predominantly Black east side of the city and remain all Black. Hall High will be built on the other side of the city in a more affluent white area, and no Black students would be admitted. Central was surrounded by working class, white, and racially mixed neighborhoods and will become the first testing ground for school integration in the city. I watched man rise slowly from the dirt when my friends and I carpooled or took the bus to Gilliam Park to swim during the summer of 1955. I couldn't help thinking that in a few years I would be a student there. Even then, I thought it made no sense that I would have to travel even more than 2 miles I traveled to Dunbar when Central High was so close to my home. But my high school was on the back burner. I was just looking forward to returning to Dunbar for 8th grade. In August of that summer, though, a brutal crime nearly 200 miles away in Money, Mississippi, rattled me to the core. I first heard the name of Emmett Till whispered from the lips of adults, speaking in a hushed tones around my house about the horrible thing the white people did to that little Black boy in Mississippi. My parents subscribed to the Chicago Defender, that city's Black newspaper, and it was there that I first read the full, terrifying story. Let's go back to our homework question. How did Emmett Till and the Montgomery bus boycott affect Carlotta? How do you know? Use evidence from the text. Carlotta says, the story was terrifying. As I followed the story for weeks in the Black press, I couldn't get the images out of my head. How Till, a 14-year-old Chicago boy visiting his great uncle in Money, Mississippi, walked to the white owned Bryant's grocery store on August 24, 1955, with some friends after a long day in the cotton fields. How the teenager, unfamiliar with the deadly taboos of the South, may have whistled at a white woman while leaving the store. How Roy Bryant, the store owner, and the white woman's husband showed up 4 days later with his half brother at the home where Till was staying and dragged him away. How Till's battered and mutilated body was pulled from the Tallahatchie River a few days later. How the body had been weighed down by a 75-pound cotton gin fan attached by barbed wire. As horrible as those images were in my imagination, nothing could have prepared me for the real life pictures I saw when Mother's September 15, 1955 issue of Jet magazine arrived at our home. As I flipped open the magazine and I turned to the story about Emmett Till's memorial service, I gasped. The photo of his badly disfigured corpse was right there in black and white. Part of me was so horrified that I wanted to turn the page quickly or throw the book down, but I couldn't take my eyes off his bloated, monstrous face. It was one of those moments when legend meets reality. I had read stories before about lynching of Black folks in Mississippi and other areas of the Deep South. I'd even heard my relatives tell the story of a lynching in downtown Little Rock. A woman who appeared to be in her early 40s sat on her porch about 5 blocks from my home every day, just staring at passersby through sad, empty eyes. Her mind was never quite right. My folks said because her brother had been lynched on Broadway when he was still in her mother's womb. To me, such stories were tragic yet distant history. But I knew Emmett Till. I'd never laid eyes on him before the magazine photos, but in the handsome face of the boy he had been before his murder, I saw my cousins, my friends, my classmates. He was just 1.5 years older than me, and as real to me as the black playmates I met on the softball field every day. I imagine that Emmett was probably a popular teenager, eager to show off his big city ways to his small town southern friends, like my cousin Robert Henry, whose prowess on the field near my house and no small amount of envy had gotten him kicked off our neighborhood softball team. I imagined that the country store where Emmett may have acted on the dare of his friends that summer day looked like Mr. Thompson's shop, the white owned store across the street from Uncle Teet's house. And what teenager hasn't said or done something silly to impress others? But Emmett's death said to me that for a black child, a little too much confidence, a joke, saying or doing the wrong thing in the wrong place at the wrong time, or just being the wrong color could cost him his life. Because of what happened to Emmett Till, Mississippi became a fearsome place in my mind, and I wanted never to set foot there. That must have been the case with the adults in my family too, because from the moment on, Daddy mapped out our road trips so that we never even passed through Mississippi. Those were the days before the interstate highway system, and sometimes we might have gotten to our destination quicker by going through Mississippi, but we weren't taking any chances. Somehow, though, I still did not see Little Rock through the same eyes as I saw Mississippi. Yes, Little Rock was the South. Yes, I had to sit in the back of the bus and climb to the black section in the balcony when Peggy, Reba, and I walked to the Lee Theater for the Saturday afternoon show. Yes, I heard white folks make degrading comments. Even though I had relatives who lived in the predominantly white neighborhoods on the West End around the 202-acre War Memorial Park, I knew I couldn't swim there because the pool was for whites only. Yet in my mind, my hometown Yet in my mind, my hometown was not as bad as Mississippi. Till's murder had set the bar for racial evil in my mind. And compared with that, Little Rock was somewhere on the other end of the spectrum, or so I thought. At that point, I had always played by the rules. I never stepped out of my so called place. That would come a few years later, and I would be shocked and saddened to see my hometown for the first time as it really was. In some ways, though, Little Rock was indeed more progressive than many areas of the South. The city's public libraries had been integrated without any trouble in January 1951, and despite the limitations and motivations of the Blossom Plan, the Little Rock School District was among the first in the South to respond in any way to the U.S. Supreme Court decision mandating school desegregation. But black residents in Little Rock were growing restless of being treated like second class citizens. With the massive show of black togetherness and power taking place in Montgomery, Alabama at the end of 1955, some black residents were also starting to feel empowered. I recognized the infectious power of the Montgomery movement one day in early 1956 when my cousin Dolores and I decided to ride the bus downtown. As we stepped on board, we noticed Alexine Duncan, one of the granddaughters of the older couple who lived across the street from me. Alexine was in her 20s and had spent some time in Denver, Colorado, where her father operated an upscale men's clothing store. Like me, she had traveled up north and lived another way. Dolores and I waved hello, and we sat across from her in the middle of the bus, where the black section began. The bus grew more and more crowded as it traveled down Park Avenue. Suddenly, at one stop, a white passenger boarded, and the driver looked up into the rear view mirror at Dolores and me and shouted over his shoulder, "You two girls, get up." We knew he meant for us to go to the back and clear that row for white passengers. Without question, we were about to comply when I heard a sharp reply from across the aisle. "Oh, no, you don't. You stay right there." Dolores and I froze in our tracks and looked up. It was Alexine. She was fuming. Her arms were folded across her chest, and she was staring the bus driver down. We had a right to sit there, she demanded. Hadn't he heard about the Montgomery bus boycotts? I had felt such pride reading about how the black people of that city were refusing to ride public buses to protest the system's segregated practices. I eagerly followed the news stories and photos in black newspapers and magazines showing how 50,000 black men and women were working together, walking and carpooling to work, church, and everywhere else they had to go, while empty buses crisscrossed the city. I knew the whole story, how a small act of defiance by Rosa Parks had ignited the bus boycott. And that's part of this last question. We just read about Emmett Till, but now it's getting into Rosa Parks and her attempt to integrate buses in Montgomery, Alabama. So here it goes on. What a gracious lady. I imagined that she was just bone tired that day when she quietly refused a white bus driver's orders that she give up her seat to a white passenger. I had sat on the bus next to many black women like her in Little Rock. They would be headed home from jobs cleaning, cooking, and sewing in white people's homes and businesses, so tired they could hardly or barely keep their eyes open. When I saw that iconic black and white photograph of Rosa Parks being fingerprinted after her arrest for taking such a bold stand, I thought of all the hard-working women she had lifted by keeping her seat. And she became my forever shero. I knew that Alexine was probably thinking of Rosa Parks and feeling the call of history to take her own stand. But as she grew louder, refusing to back down even after the bus driver threatened to call the police, I grew more frightened. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to run off the bus. I wanted to tell her that I knew she meant well, but I just wanted her to be quiet, please, and let me go to the back of the bus. I'd never been the kind of person to make a scene, and that was the last thing I wanted right then. But it was too late. The next thing I knew, the police were climbing aboard to escort Alexine off the bus. Dolores and I got off too, and I quietly walked back home. I never talked to Alexine about what happened that day, but I always felt horrible that she had landed in the hands of the police for standing up for me on that bus. Little did I know that another integration battle was heating up in my hometown, and soon I would take my own stand.